They contacted me at 1:45 in the morning while I was resolving a major server outage in Seattle that was bleeding $82,000 every hour. The voice on the other end of the line was cold, informing me that my contract would end at 6 in the morning today and would not be renewed. I did not panic. I simply replied that I would notify the tech director that they would be taking over the remediation since my access was scheduled to be revoked. In that single moment, the silence on the line told me they finally understood the gravity of what they had just done. My name is Dominic Vance, and until that moment, I was the senior infrastructure engineer at Apex FinTech Solutions. We were a financial technology firm managing critical payment gateways for 22 major banking clients across the West Coast. My primary responsibility was to keep the transaction pipelines open and stable. In our line of work, system downtime is measured in seconds, and every minute of outage represents a significant financial loss. That Tuesday night began quietly. I had just tucked my daughter Lucy into bed after helping her finish a school project about volcanic eruptions. My wife Clara was wrapping up some design work at her desk. I was winding down by watching a documentary when my phone began vibrating continuously at 1:58 in the morning. The Seattle data center, our primary hub for processing real-time retail banking transactions, had completely collapsed. It was entirely offline. I immediately opened my laptop and connected to the corporate private network. Clara walked in, looking concerned. I told her it was a major system failure. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I analyzed the system logs. The failure was cascading rapidly, causing credit card declines, frozen cash withdrawals, and failed electronic deposits across the region. Within 4 minutes, I identified the cause. A corrupt routing table had created a feedback loop, consuming all available network bandwidth. The automated failover protocol had failed to trigger because someone had manually disabled it during a routine maintenance window the previous week. I did not have time to search for the culprit. I had to stop the bleeding. Rerouting traffic to our backup systems in Phoenix was a delicate operation. A single error could crash the backup systems as well, doubling our disaster. While I was focused on the screens, my phone rang. It was Gerald Fletcher, our tech director. He was frantic, asking for a status update. I told him I was already working on the fix and needed about 20 minutes to stabilize the system if nothing else went wrong. He told me to do what was necessary. Gerald knew my capabilities. We had worked together for 5 years, ever since the company acquired the startup where I had built my reputation for solving complex infrastructure problems. Clara brought me a mug of black coffee, kissed my forehead, and walked out. She knew that when I was in this state, I operated with mechanical focus. By 2:38 in the morning, I had successfully rerouted the payment traffic through our Phoenix servers. Transaction processing resumed and error rates began to decline. That was when my phone buzzed with an urgent email from Nolan Brooks, the vice president of operations. I had dealt with Nolan exactly 4 times during my tenure at the company. Every interaction was unpleasant. Nolan was the kind of corporate executive who excelled at claiming credit for other people's achievements while shifting blame for his own failures. He was a man of expensive suits, rehearsed smiles, and a complete lack of technical understanding regarding the systems he managed. His message read that we need to discuss my contract status immediately. It was 2:39 in the morning, and while I was actively saving the company from a financial catastrophe, he wanted to play administrative games. I ignored the message and continued stabilizing the systems. I searched the maintenance logs to find out who had disabled the failover protocol. My blood ran cold when I saw the digital signature. Nolan Brooks had authorized the change 8 days ago, ordering the failover disabled to save on redundancy testing costs. I took screenshots of the email and log entries, sending them to my personal email address. My phone rang again. It was Nolan. I answered and told him I was in the middle of resolving an outage costing $82,000 an hour. He told me the contract discussion could not wait. He stated that my contract expired at 6 in the morning and the company had decided not to renew it. He was letting me go in less than 4 hours while I was resolving a critical system outage. He claimed it was an administrative oversight, that human resources had failed to notify me earlier, and he was telling me now as a courtesy. I told him that since my contract ended in less than 4 hours, I would log off at 6 in the morning and notify Gerald Fletcher that Nolan would be taking over the remediation work. There was a long silence on the line. Nolan asked for the status of the outage. I told him I was actively resolving it, but since I would no longer be employed in a few hours, I would log off. He began to backpedal, saying we could discuss the contract. I told him I required a written confirmation of my contract extension, clear access rights, and authorization to work the incident within 30 minutes. Otherwise, I would log off at 6 in the morning sharp, and he could explain the ongoing outage to the executive board. Nolan was furious, telling me I could not do that. I reminded him that as an independent contractor, I had no obligation to work past my contract terms. I hung up. Clara looked at me from the doorway, her eyes wide. I told her that he had chosen the worst possible moment to assert his authority, and I was not going to let him step on me. The next 38 minutes were the longest of my life. I continued monitoring the systems, documenting every step of my remediation work in meticulous detail. If they were going to force me out, they would at least have a clear record of what I had done to save them. At 3:11 in the morning, an email arrived from Nolan with Gerald Fletcher, and someone from Human Resources copied. It confirmed my contract extension through the week with compensation for emergency response work and a meeting scheduled for Thursday to discuss future arrangements. I smiled, but it was not a happy smile. By 5:15 in the morning, I had the Seattle data center back online, all failover protocols re-enabled, and a comprehensive incident report documenting exactly how Nolan Brooks' cost-cutting measure had caused a multi-million-dollar crisis. I sent it to Gerald with Nolan copied. Gerald called immediately, telling me I was brilliant and to get some sleep. I woke up at 1 in the afternoon to 24 missed calls and 51 emails. Instead of disaster, I found professional gratitude from Gerald, silence from Nolan, and a meeting invitation for 3 in the afternoon that day titled Infrastructure Review. The knot in my stomach tightened. Clara had taken the day off to work from home. She had picked up Lucy from school, and they were making cookies in the kitchen, her laughter drifting upstairs. I walked down to the kitchen, taking in the sweet aroma of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies. I grabbed one from the cooling rack and took a bite, letting the warmth distract me from my anxiety. For a moment, I let myself pretend everything was normal. Then I opened my laptop and started preparing for war. The thing about working in information technology infrastructure for 5 years is you develop a comprehensive understanding of where all the problems are hidden. You know which systems are held together with digital tape and prayer. You know which supposedly redundant backups have not been tested in 22 months. You know exactly how fragile everything really is. And if you are smart, you have been documenting it all. I had started keeping detailed records about 10 months ago when Nolan first arrived at the company. He had immediately started making technical decisions based purely on budget numbers, overruling the engineers who actually understood the systems. Gerald had pushed back where he could, but Nolan had the ear of the chief executive officer and a talent for making dangerous choices sound fiscally responsible. The disabled failover protocol was not his first risky call. It was just the first one that had blown up spectacularly. I spent 3 hours compiling a folder of documentation, emails where I had warned about infrastructure vulnerabilities, budget proposals Nolan had rejected, maintenance windows he had shortened against recommendations, and incident reports from smaller outages. I did not plan to use it all, but I wanted it ready. At 2:45 in the afternoon, I logged into the video conference for the infrastructure review. Gerald appeared first, looking tired but pleased. Then Nolan joined, his expression completely neutral, which somehow felt more threatening than anger would have been. Gerald thanked me warmly for my exceptional work and stated that the executive team was very pleased. Then Nolan cleared his throat. He said my contract situation represented an opportunity to restructure our support model. He announced they were moving toward an external managed service provider arrangement that would give broader coverage at a reduced cost. My contract would conclude on Thursday. They were giving me only 4 days to transfer 5 years of specialized knowledge about their critically important, embarrassingly fragile infrastructure. Gerald looked uncomfortable. Nolan interrupted him smoothly, saying they would compensate me fairly for the transition work and that my cooperation would be noted in my references. It was an implicit threat. Cooperate or we will make your job search difficult. I took a breath, considering my options. I could fight, argue, leverage my position, or I could do something much smarter. I agreed pleasantly to prepare comprehensive documentation and asked when the team would arrive. Nolan smiled, saying they would arrive tomorrow morning. When the meeting ended, I sat staring at my screen. They were really doing this, firing the engineer who just saved them millions because Nolan wanted to prove he could cut costs. Clara appeared with coffee, reading my expression. I told her they gave me 4 days. She winced, asking what I was going to do. I told her I would do exactly what they asked. I was going to document everything. Something in my tone made her pause, asking why she felt there was more to that statement. I told her that they wanted documentation and they were going to get the most thorough, comprehensive, meticulously detailed documentation ever created. I would document every fragile component, every workaround, and every unsupported system. It would be entirely professional but also completely and brutally honest about the state of their infrastructure, which would terrify anyone who actually read it. Clara understood, smiling as she realized I was creating evidence. When the new team realized what they had signed up for and the house of cards collapsed, there would be no question about who had warned them. The managed service provider team arrived on Wednesday morning. They were 2 engineers named Logan and Jason, who seemed competent, but were completely overwhelmed. When I started walking them through the Seattle data center architecture, I prepared a 240-page documentation package organized by system, with detailed notes on every quirk, vulnerability, and makeshift solution. Logan scrolled through the file, noting how extensive it was. I replied that our infrastructure was indeed extensive, supporting payment processing for 22 banking clients. Downtime was not an option, and neither was error. Jason looked pale and asked how much was automated. I told him about 70% was automated, while the remaining 30% required human judgment and institutional knowledge. For example, the Pittsburgh data cluster had a memory leak issue that had not been patched because the vendor discontinued support for that hardware generation. It needed a manual restart every 96 hours, specifically between 1 in the morning and 3 in the morning when transaction volume was lowest, following a specific sequence, or else the session databases would corrupt. I watched them frantically taking notes and asking if that was in the documentation. I directed them to page 112, section 6, subsection C. We continued like this for 6 hours. Every question they asked, I answered thoroughly and honestly, always referencing the specific page in my documentation. I was the model of professional cooperation, but I was also systematically revealing that the infrastructure was far more complex and fragile than Nolan had led them to believe. By Thursday, Jason had asked twice if they could extend my contract to provide ongoing consultation. I politely explained that would need to be arranged through Nolan. Nolan was conspicuously absent. Gerald checked in daily, growing increasingly concerned as he sat in on the knowledge transfer sessions and realized the magnitude of what they were losing. He pulled me into a private call on Thursday afternoon, expressing that he did not know Nolan was planning this and had pushed back hard, but Nolan had gone straight to the chief financial officer with his cost savings projections. I thanked Gerald, asking him to give them honest feedback when things inevitably fell apart. Friday morning, my last day, started with an emergency meeting. The external team had formally requested a 4-month overlap period, with me remaining available for consultation. Nolan had promised them a simple, well-documented infrastructure. Instead, they discovered a complex, partially antiquated, business-critical system that required constant expert attention. Nolan looked like he had aged 5 years. He asked me to extend my availability on a consulting basis for 90 days, offering part-time availability for questions and emergency support. I asked what rate they were offering. Nolan looked uncomfortable, and I stated my terms. My consulting rate would be $320 an hour, with a 6-hour minimum per incident, and I would need a formal contract by the end of the business day. Nolan's jaw tightened, stating that it seemed excessive. I replied that it was the standard rate for emergency infrastructure consulting, and that alternatively, Logan and Jason seemed capable and would figure things out eventually. Gerald jumped in, recommending they proceed given the risk profile. 2 hours later, I had a signed consulting contract guaranteeing me at least 15 hours a week for 10 weeks at consultant rates, with additional emergency fees. I had turned my termination into a $45,000 consulting arrangement. Clara laughed when I told her, calling me terrifying. I told her I was just being fair. They wanted to replace me with a cheaper option, but when budget fantasy met reality, I was not obligated to fix it for free. The weekend passed quietly. I spent Saturday at my daughter's soccer game and Sunday doing absolutely nothing work-related. Monday morning, my phone rang at 5:30 in the morning. It was Logan, panicking. The Pittsburgh cluster had not restarted properly. They followed the documentation, but transactions were queuing and not processing. They were 20 minutes from major client impact. I opened my laptop, logged in, and asked if they had cleared the temporary cache files before initiating the restart sequence. Logan was silent, then admitted they had skipped reading that step. 20 minutes later, I walked them through the fix. I logged 5 hours, sent an invoice, and went about my day. I spent my afternoon sitting on the back deck, sipping iced tea while watching my phone remain silent. When it did ring, I was polite and professional, but I made sure to log every single minute of my time. The external team was grateful for the guidance, and I was happy to help them succeed, as long as the company was paying my consulting rates. 4 similar calls came over the next week, each time because they had not read the documentation properly. I resolved each issue professionally and billed them accordingly. After the 5th incident, Gerald called. He admitted they were not ready, and that Nolan was getting pressure from the chief financial officer about the high consulting fees. Gerald asked if I would return to a full-time position with a 25% raise from my previous rate, reporting directly to him. I agreed, on the condition of an 8-month severance clause, if my reporting structure ever changed. Gerald promised to have human resources draft the agreement. I returned to the office the following Wednesday as an official employee, rather than an independent contractor. My new contract secured my position, complete with full benefits, reporting protection, and the 8-month severance clause. The transition back was smooth, but I knew my battles with Nolan were far from over. I felt a sense of quiet triumph walking through the doors, knowing my value had been proven in the most undeniable way. However, I remained cautious, expecting Nolan to seek a new angle of attack. Thursday afternoon, during my first staff meeting in my new role, Nolan sat at the head of the table. He looked composed, but I could see the resentment in his eyes. At the end of the meeting, Nolan announced a new policy. He stated that the company was implementing a new change management protocol for all infrastructure updates. All changes, regardless of urgency, would require his written approval before implementation. He claimed this was about accountability and oversight, but he was looking directly at me. It was retaliation, thinly disguised as corporate policy. He wanted to create a bureaucratic mechanism to control and slow down my work. Manufacturing failures he could attribute to my insubordination. I kept my expression neutral and asked what the turnaround time for approval would be. Nolan replied that it would be 36 hours for standard changes and 3 hours for emergency changes. 3 hours during an active outage would be catastrophic. He was setting me up to fail. Gerald Fletcher immediately argued that this would create bottlenecks for time-sensitive updates, but Nolan claimed the decision was already approved and effective immediately. I spent the rest of the day documenting the new policy and projecting its impact on our incident response times. The numbers were clear. Our average time to resolution would triple, and our service-level agreements with major banking clients would be impossible to meet. I compiled a brief, factual report and sent it to Gerald, copying Nolan. It was professional, objective, and completely devastating to Nolan policy. Friday morning, I was invited to a meeting with the Chief Technology Officer, Eleanor Wu. Gerald and Nolan were also present. Eleanor did not waste time, asking me to walk her through my impact analysis. I showed how the approval delays would affect our systems using examples from recent outages. By the time I finished, Nolan was visibly frustrated, claiming my projections assumed worst-case scenarios. I replied that these were scenarios we had actually experienced. Eleanor agreed that Nolan's policy was too risky and would put the company in breach of its client agreements. She rejected the policy. Nolan's expression went blank. It was the look of someone who had lost a battle but was already planning his next move. He suggested a modified version with a risk committee defining thresholds. Eleanor agreed, naming me as the engineering representative on the committee. Nolan had failed to control my work directly, so he was building a bureaucratic cage instead. The risk committee met the following week. Along with Nolan and me, there was Yolanda Park from operations and Thomas Brennan from security. Thomas was a 25-year veteran of cybersecurity who tolerated zero nonsense. He listened to Nolan's complex proposal for 10 minutes before interrupting. He suggested a simple scoring framework based on blast radius, rollback capability, business impact, and timing. Nolan tried to argue, but Thomas held his ground, pointing out that complexity is the enemy of stability. We hammered out a reasonable framework, despite Nolan's attempts to insert clauses giving him unilateral authority. Thomas caught every single one, exposing them. That framework worked well for about a month. Then, the Seattle data center required a critical security patch for a vulnerability being actively exploited. I scheduled the patch for the weekend, but Nolan sent an email requesting it be delayed for additional review. I responded with a detailed explanation, copying the committee. Thomas backed me up, but Nolan insisted on waiting. I called Eleanor Wu directly, explaining the risk of delaying a patch for an active exploit. Eleanor authorized the deployment immediately, stating the framework was the decision-making authority. I deployed the patch, and it went flawlessly. Monday morning, I was called into a meeting with Nolan and Nancy Hartwell from Human Resources. Nancy explained that a complaint had been filed regarding my communication style and responsiveness to leadership feedback. She cited my deployment of the security patch, despite Nolan's request, as well as conflicts during the transition. Nolan claimed I had a pattern of disregarding input. I demanded specifics, pointing out that I had CTO authorization for the patch, and that the transition issues were documented instructions that the new team had ignored. I told them this was clear retaliation for refusing to be pushed out. I explained that every single issue brought up was a direct result of my defending the company's systems from Nolan's poor decisions, which were driven entirely by his own ego rather than the technical needs of our banking clients. I made it clear that I had kept meticulous records of all our communications. The room fell silent as I laid out the facts. I told Nancy Hartwell that I could document every single interaction being misrepresented, using emails, chat logs, and witnesses. I offered to compile the records by the end of the day. Nolan's expression hardened, claiming the meeting was about my conduct, not his own. I replied that we should indeed discuss conduct. I pointed out that he had disabled failover protocols to cut costs, causing a major outage, and had tried to terminate my contract during the crisis. He had repeatedly tried to override the approved risk framework, and now he was filing false complaints to create grounds for my termination. I stated that this was not leadership, but rather retaliation, and that it was illegal. Furthermore, I revealed my knowledge of his latest action. Nolan had recently attempted to claim ownership of my proprietary automation software, which I had developed years before joining the company. When I had refused to sign his intellectual property assignment agreement, he had forged my signature on the document and submitted it to the legal department. I told him that my attorney, Gabrielle Ross, was already reviewing the forgery and preparing immediate legal action. I walked out of the meeting, leaving Nolan looking completely stunned and pale. That afternoon, Gabrielle sent a formal letter to Nancy and Eleanor Wu. The letter was 5 pages long, detailing the exact timeline of Nolan's actions and showing how his conduct violated both civil and criminal statutes. She made it clear that we were prepared to file a formal lawsuit in federal court if the company did not act immediately. The letter cited 17 U.S.C. Section 106, outlining my exclusive rights as the copyright holder of the software, and stated that any unauthorized use or claim of ownership by the company constituted copyright infringement. The letter also cited California Penal Code Section 470, detailing the criminal nature of the forged signature on the assignment agreement, and declared the document void ab initio. The legal department was terrified of the massive liability. Within 48 hours, the company suspended Nolan Brooks pending an internal investigation into the forgery and retaliation. 3 weeks later, Nolan resigned in disgrace. With Nolan gone, the corporate environment improved significantly. However, during the annual budget planning, the chief financial officer, Edward Wade, attempted to cut costs by proposing to eliminate my internal position once again and expand the managed service contract. Gerald Fletcher fought back, but the financial pressure was high. 2 weeks later, a major data corruption issue occurred in the transaction database late at night. Logan and Jason panicked, unable to locate the source of the error. They called me at 10 in the evening. I logged in and found a replication error propagating through our backup systems. I immediately initiated emergency recovery procedures, isolating the primary database and restoring from a clean backup. I spent 5 hours resolving the crisis, stabilizing the database by 2 in the morning with minimal data loss. The next day, the incident report clearly demonstrated that without internal expertise, the company would have suffered a catastrophic loss of data and severe financial penalties. The chief financial officer withdrew his proposal. My position was secured, and I was promoted to principal infrastructure architect, with a team of 3 engineers reporting directly to me. My salary was increased, and my authority was expanded. Looking back on the experience, I realized that my survival had not been a matter of luck. I had survived because I documented everything, built strong alliances with competent professionals like Gerald Fletcher and Thomas Brennan, and refused to back down. I had used the law, specifically 17 U.S.C. Section 106 and California Penal Code, Section 470, as a shield against corporate bullying. The system is rarely fair, but when you stand your ground with clear evidence and professional competence, you can sometimes make it work in your favor, and that is the most satisfying victory of all. I had turned a midnight firing into a promotion and a team of my own, showing that technical expertise combined with strategic planning is the ultimate defense in the corporate world. My daughter Lucy was thrilled. When I told her I would be working from home more often, and Clara and I celebrated with a quiet dinner. The company learned a valuable lesson about the importance of internal expertise, and I learned that documentation is the best defense against corporate politics. In the months that followed, my team and I worked diligently to stabilize the entire infrastructure, making it more resilient and modern. We automated the recovery protocols so that another midnight crisis would never happen again, ensuring the 22 banks we served remained completely secure. I no longer had to look over my shoulder, knowing my work was valued and protected by my team, the tech director, and the CTO. Gerald even invited me to a celebration lunch where he expressed his profound gratitude, noting that without my diligence, the entire operations department would have collapsed. We now work in an environment built on mutual respect and technical competence rather than corporate politics and ego. The lessons we learned from this ordeal became standard policy, ensuring that technical expertise is always prioritized over bureaucratic games.